Arriving here and now, and allowing each exhale of the breath to release anything from the past moments, minutes, hours, days, months, and even years, feeling lighter and lighter with each breath, more and more present here and now. Arriving in the body as it is, welcoming any sensations present, maybe softening the belly, letting the breath fill the belly. And lengthening the spine, feeling the spaciousness between each vertebra, from the root all up through the crown. Exhaling, softening the belly. Inhaling, lengthening the spine. Arriving as you are, whole and complete. And as we open this space together, inviting the sound of the singing bowl to welcome us even more fully present. Opening the eyes if they're not open already. And welcome to Spiraling Within. I am Pei-Ling, and here we spiral within the present moment together. And it is such a joy to welcome our guest this week. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Glenn Lym, and there's a lot of different ways I think of myself, so I don't really know what, but we met over a dinner conversation. You were at a nearby table, and COVID spacing of the tables didn't inhibit conversation, and it was a spectacular meal. So I am a fourth or fifth generation Chinese American. On my father's side, my great-grandfather came over in 1855. And it's all a history, and history defines you. And oftentimes, I don't understand the history until later. And then I realized that my father didn't understand his history until later. And of course, there is no complete history. It's just how it figures into one's place at the moment. So that's one part. So I've grown up in the Bay Area, and for 8 years, around college time, I was in New England for 8 years. And a very profound experience. And it was then back in 1970. I'm pretty old. I was born in 1944. So, and so me and all my friends say, oh, yeah, we're just who we are. But actually, we're the ancient the ancient people here, right? And living in downtown San Francisco and south of Market, everyone is your age, Pei-Ling. And so I am constantly reminded and overjoyed by it, actually. And my age coherent friends are living in other parts of California or elsewhere where they're surrounded by people their own age. And I think, well, okay, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
But anyway, so a couple of different areas. I think I'm in a period of transitioning into what would be called retirement, which means that my career as an architect, I'm trying to actually put a close to, in part because there are liability issues with regard to the practice of architecture that I need to close. And in part because at my age, my ability, I took my studio, and instead of having employees, I for the last 10 years have operated it as a one-man show, and there's a lot of things I just hate doing anymore. Plus, the mental capacity to hold it all together and enjoy it, I'm just saying, although I've been pretty gifted to have nice clients. And so actually, that's one of the things I became an architect because I wanted to get involved in people's houses. And now as I've gotten older, that's one of my projects is, why was that interesting to me to get involved in people's houses, right? And so partly that comes because in the 10 years, in the period after 2008, which was the second big recession of recent history, that's when I slimmed down my office. Actually, all my work vanished for a year and a half. And I said, gee, what am I going to do? And so then I said, oh, there are these interesting questions I've had, like looking around my neighborhood here. Why are half the buildings crooked? They look like they're sinking into the ground. They're like tilted and sinking, right? So there were questions like that. And I started to make, and I always like to sort of play around with film. So I started making documentaries. And so I have this sort of series of documentaries get made every 2 years. And when we met, I was just finishing the most recent one, which was instead of looking around at things, I was looking around at people. And it was COVID, and the people I was looking at who are out on the street, you would say are quite challenged. And that was an eye-opener to me to deal with that material, which is to ask, I could see, because I was using the surveillance cameras of my condominium building, but then since it was on film, I could play it and play it and play it over again until I think I understood what was going on. And in some cases, I had heard what was going on, so I also had in some cases, recordings or my memories of what was happening. So that was really interesting because unlike documentaries about things, documentaries involving people are, there are many different events mean many different things. They don't just mean one thing. And working through all that was really quite interesting. So so that's a little bit about me. And then today is a day in which I used to be a Grateful Dead fan, Deadhead, and I spent decades of my life doing that. And so this evening, me and my Deadhead friend are doing pay-per-view from Mountain View, since at my age, I do not want to spend all day spending a lot of money on an expensive ticket and getting in traffic jams. But the role of music as a transcendent vehicle is very important in my life, actually, which comes from my family of origin, which we can talk about if that's of interest. So.
Yeah. Wow. What a beautiful and comprehensive and introduction of yourself. And I also, the through lines that are really speaking to me in this moment are really your curiosity and then your creativity. It's like you have these questions, and then the things that you create, whether it's environments or houses or these documentary films, it's like a quest. It's like a quest for your curiosity. And that's like really, it's such a universally human quality of we have these questions and then we're inspired to go and step towards them. And I think that is something that I do find so inspiring about you. And even like recollecting to the moment that we began chatting at dinner that one day, because even just zooming back to that moment, because our tables were right next to each other, and I immediately noticed you and Ruth, because, you know, an older Asian man with an older white woman. And for me, it was like this mirroring of my parents because my dad being Chinese Malaysian and my mom being English Irish, it was, and then also the synchronicity of me being this like all by myself, this half white, half Asian young woman parallel to your daughter as well. There was all of that mirroring and kind of like synchronistic alignment that was just so cool to kind of unfold throughout the conversation. And yeah, even what the inspiration of hearing that you were like creating these documentary films and sharing them on YouTube, I think it was just me being where I am currently in my journey and in many ways, like the beginnings of my creative expression in the world, and to hear you take something you're passionate about and then just create it, and create it for the love of creating it, and for that, just that interest, that inherent interest of discovering it for yourself, regardless of, like, it was so clear to me that you weren't creating these documentary films for popularity or for an outcome or for anything else. You know, there was like, no, you're not doing it to get to like Sundance or something. It's like, it's like for the journey and the exploration and the self-discovery even. And the fact that you like are rewatching these surveillance tapes or whatever footage that you're encountering or whatever material you're diving into, because I know that you've done documentary films on your family story, and even like diving into family history as well. Like it's this beautiful journey of just, self-discovery, self-awareness, self-understanding, and also understanding and engaging with the world around you through that art form.
Well, thank you. Yeah, that's a really good point. And actually, it's actually through the documentaries that I think I am most curious, and it's probably because of the lack of curiosity with regard to my architectural practice, which is another reason why I'm leaving. Because in architecture, it's not free, you're being paid by somebody. And they want something out of you. And I think the way I conducted my architectural practice was not as open as it might be. But we can go into that at some point. But
yeah, that's really interesting, because I'm also interested because you've been in architecture your entire career and from the time you were a student and in college, and do you feel like part of that was the context with which your education was rooted, like the context in history and time, and then how that, because I don't know what architecture school is like now, but do you feel like that it's evolved, that openness, or just that the way that architects relate to clients?
Well, okay, so I'll head into that. I have my architecture degree through University of California, Berkeley in the 1960s. And at that time, the undergraduate program had a 5-year program, which was a professionally accredited undergraduate architecture degree, which gave you a lot of years towards your license. Architecture, for some reason, has such really ridiculously difficult licensing requirements, given the fact that the profession generally doesn't pay, or at least back then didn't pay very well. So this actually relates to my families of origin, but I'll hold that off for a bit. So I went to Berkeley at a period of time when there were five really world important divergent teachers who had completely different ideas of what architecture was. And that was a philosophy that was created by the department early on, and the chairman of the department at that time was a guy by the name of Charles Moore, who would then go on to Yale and then UCLA and end up at University of Texas, Austin. And he was really interested in creating a five-ring circus. So that contrasted with where I wanted to go to school but could not because my parents told me they were no way were they going to pay any money for my education. I needed to go where they had gone, and they had gone to UC Berkeley, so I was going to UC Berkeley. So I wanted to go to the University of Pennsylvania, which in architecture had the great architect Louis Kahn there as the mainstay. So that would have been, instead of five-ring circus, a one-ring circus.
Yeah.
So there was a difference between West Coast and East Coast. East Coast was about designing important cultural and political buildings. You were not doing little vernacular little villages. You were doing cathedrals, museums, city halls, big things. And Berkeley, being in part an expression of California, was all about whatever. So one of my professors who created the Farallons Institute, which was an early eco design place, his big project was doing a compostable toilet, which probably people on the East Coast would have thought totally ridiculous thing for architects to do.
Yeah.
So it came forth, and then over the years I worked for a number of people in the architecture who were my professors there, and I remember a slideshow. This was an office that I was in for about a decade in San Francisco, which, among other things, the most famous building it's done is the Monterey Bay Aquarium. And so this office used to have slideshows, and people would bring in their slides from a visit, right? So I remember a slideshow where Marion brought in her pictures from a visit to Venice. This is probably 1988. And so she's showing all these pictures. Oh, there's the canal, here's this, and here's the cathedral, and here's this. And all of a sudden, the partners started talking about how wonderful the little tenement buildings were. And it was a dual slideshow. So she was showing slides on one side, the chapels, and on the other side, the little tenement buildings. And the partners were all talking about how wonderful the tenements were and how beautiful the forms were. And this was a real interesting depiction between vernacular and sort of prized architectural work. That was very, very telling. But in my background, I come from a family, Chinese were not able to practice architecture before maybe 1940s, 1950s. Because if you were Chinese, you just did not get that kind of work. And or you're excluded from the profession. And so I had several architects, three in my family, who were practicing. And so they were part of the, there was work going around me. And then in my family of origin, it was very important that you know what your career was going to be. So my mother wanted me to be a doctor, in part because she had wanted to be a doctor, and her father said, no, you will not be a doctor, you will be a housewife. She grew up in she was actually born in China, and she came over at age 7, and when her father was ready to provide for her and her mother, and so she and her mother came over to California from China, and they lived in Central California, Kalinga. There are two Chinese families there who didn't speak to each other, and they ran opposite grocery stores. And so the family soon became 7 kids, and my mother's role was to raise the kids because her mother cleaned the house, cooked for all the kids, plus my grandfather on that side had like 7 or 8 employees who were also from China, and they lived in the barn. So, and so my mother had wanted to be a doctor, and instead my grandfather sent all of his sons to medical school, which really pissed my mother off. But a client of my grandfather had said, "Well, if you send her to college, she'll marry a better man." So she went to UC Berkeley, and that's where she met my father, among other things. So my mother was intent that I be a doctor because she hadn't been able to be a doctor, and that was not something I was interested in doing. And my father, who grew up in this family that had been here since 1855, he really didn't care what I did. He just wanted me to be an alpha macho male like him, which I was not. And so my father's younger brother was an architect, and he was gay, and my father was massively homophobic. And
was that out? Was that known in the family, or was that under wraps?
Everyone, it was like, but as I got to know my uncle and his life better, I realized he was completely out, and in a way, he was sexually more realized than my father ever could be.
Yeah.
And so
when did you get to dive, because I find this uncle very fascinating, of just like the parallels with your journey and your experience. Like, when did you dive into that history? Is that in like recent years, or were these questions of your family of origin or just your family history, were those things that even as you were maybe younger, in your 20s, 30s, 40s, did you dive into those, or is it mainly in the... No,
it was from birth. In fact,
from birth.
Yeah, I'm actually still exploring it now because I realized that my mother and father suspected there was something wrong with me. And because...
Oh, you're talking about your sexuality right now.
Oh, yeah, my sexuality. And so they spent a great deal of time when I was younger trying to make sure that I was not going to be gay. And they did, and they did all sorts of things, which actually, but the big choice for me when I was 7 years old is, did I want to spend Saturdays with my father at the shooting range in Chabot, Oakland, shooting pistols? My father was an arch marksman, state champion, which to me, I didn't like the loud noises, and I thought the idea of shooting bullets, trying to hit the target right in the heart of these paper targets of men, was not so interesting. And staying in my father's home of origin with his brother, who was listening to opera and doing his moonlight architecture projects of houses, was more interesting because I could listen to the music and draw pictures, right? So that got to be I think my father was very disappointed. I didn't want to go every Saturday. In fact, I hated it. So that was the beginning, and that's basically how my interest in architecture arrived. Because at first I was going to be a car designer, but I was terrible car designer. So so in my family, the issue of defining your career, particularly for a male. Another way we defined ourselves in the family is because my mother and father were both very serious music connoisseurs. But they had completely different tastes. My father had grown up on what was the brand new music at that time, which was big band jazz. And so he just loved big band jazz. And in fact, he wanted me to love big band jazz, which I hated, actually. And my mother, for some reason, I mean, I think it's in her, she had this intuition about music. And you would call her taste world music. It was everything from Lawrence Welk and Liberace to there was a guy named Corla Pandit who you wouldn't know about Corla Pandit, but on YouTube you'd find Corla Pandit looked at the camera through, the black and white television cameras, and he had a swirling turban on as he played his organ, and he looked, probably all these women loved, and he had this great big diamond-like jewel in his turban, and I thought it was all corny. My mother loved that stuff, but it also went on to, she loved Mexican music and Mayan music there were, and all sorts of stuff. So by the time later in life, when she spent time with her first granddaughter, Hillary, who is now in her 50s, and then later Mindy, my daughter, who is in her 30s, they both had somewhat similar experiences with my mother, which is my mother taught them to do the dance of the seven veils. So, I mean, when Mindy was in preschool, they were or kindergarten or something, they were asked to show what dances it, and so Mindy, that was apparently an interesting thing. So,
what's the dance of the seven veils?
It's a belly dancing dance. And,
wow.
And my mother took belly dancing classes, right?
Oh, wow.
Oh, yeah. And that transitioned, by the end of her life, she was into Hawaiian dancing. And so she had taught Mindy Hawaiian dancing.
Yeah.
I think Hillary had missed out on that phase.
Wait, so if your mom didn't end up becoming a doctor, but she went to Berkeley, what did she end up studying?
I don't know what she graduated with, but she eventually went back to work, in part because she didn't really like raising kids, I don't think. And money was very important. So my mother and father come from completely different Chinese ethnicities. Even though they're both from the Pearl River Delta, my father's family is traditional Cantonese. And I think of Cantonese as being like American Southerners, American white Southerners, Everything is beautiful. You just keep everything underneath wraps. And my mother was from a linguistic group called Lungdu. And the Lungdu people do not speak Cantonese, and my mother and father couldn't speak to each other. The Lungdu people are very much like Bostonian Brahmins, very stiff. Money is extraordinarily important. It's the most important thing in the world. You are very careful in public. You're instrumental in public. You say what is necessary, but you say no more. And then in private, you cut each other to shreds by frankness. So it's very interesting. They're very, very frank in private with family members, whereas Cantonese tend not to be frank because they're trying to save face among each other. They're trying to be nice, even though there's also... Anyways, so that was a big difference.
Yeah.
But the basic thing in terms of so there were four of us, my sister, me, and my mother and father, and we defined ourselves not so much by profession, but by what music we liked. So you had to actually find a music, right? And so my sister became a modern jazz at that time thing. And in fact, her first, I think, boyfriend was really was considered the best jazz pianist or jazz guitarist at junior high and then eventually Berkeley High School. I grew up in Berkeley. And my interest was contemporary American classical music written between World War I and World War II, largely European. And later I came to realize it's the music of a distraught people who have been killing each other in a war, right? So it's Bela Bartok and Stravinsky and a lot of music of that era. So, and of course, no one liked my music. So I could only play it when nobody was in the house until I got my own, whatever it was, record player or something like that. So.
Yeah. Huh. That's so fascinating. And so, I mean, I can see the musical through lines with Mindy, your daughter, being a vocal coach and
Yeah,
a singer and a performer
right,
now.
right. There's,
How?
yeah.
Oh, no, go ahead, go ahead.
Well, Mindy had that in her from the beginning, and I think it was heavily influenced by my mother, who was a dance performer. And I'm not skillful on the piano, and my mother was more skillful, but she really wouldn't teach me. There was a kind of a rivalry, so that never really developed. So Mindy ended up finding a really important teacher who became actually a guru to her. And actually yesterday was an extraordinary moment because one of the people who her teacher died a couple of years ago at age 53, but about a decade ago. But when she was younger as a teenager, there were a number of younger people in the studio with the teacher, as well as of all ages. And one of those persons just won the Tony Award yesterday.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow. Aw, that's so
Yeah.
wonderful.
Yeah. No, this is quite. Anyways, so yeah, so music goes. That's how it got there. But the issue of
Yeah.
career, for me, there are a lot of architects in my family, and it made sense. And it was you know, as a teenager, I needed something to isolate myself from the family. So the music that no one was listening to, that was good. And sitting there and designing little buildings for myself, that was good, right?
Yeah. I'm curious, I love your description of the difference between your parents, your mom and your dad, just coming from different ethnic groups in China, which that's, just a wonderful thing to highlight because, there are so many individual cultures within what can be chalked together as a monolith that is China or any country. And in some ways, I'm curious of your own parenting experience, then if there was a cultural bridging, because I guess you got to experience being raised in a household where maybe, like anyone, if you have two parents, there are differences and, different cultural backgrounds, different ways of upbringing. So for some people, it's one parent grew up in a certain socioeconomic status and then another in a different class or whatnot. But your experience in an interracial family and just parenting as well, I think hearing some of the ways that you describe your parents having expectations of what did you learn from that experience of being on the receiving end of all of these expectations or pressures of how you were going to be, how you were going to be a human, whether that was from your dad of being alpha and macho as you described it, or from your mom of being a doctor, you being a parent, how did that all influence or shift or shape?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so I'll go back to a certain point. I think the thrust. My mother was actually intellectually brilliant, and so she did not. So in time, what had evolved is my mother was a master of controlling herself, controlling others. And she controlled people by altering their information environment. A very interesting way she would do this.
Yeah.
Right? And so she controlled my father. My father's basic thing, after I think he gave up making me a macho male, was my father's lifespan went from when my father first got out of college, he went to work as a chemical engineer, but his real passion wasn't developing DDT, which he helped develop, which actually then contributed to probably the deaths of himself, my mother, and my sister. because of DDT exposure. But rather, his passion was guns, and his passion was being the head of the Berkeley Police Reserves, which is actually remarkable. In 1942, I think he founded the Berkeley Police Reserves, and at that time, Chinese could not be police officers. But what they had was a rule that you had to be taller than 5'6". And of course, my father was 5'4", right? And they had no Asians or anything on because it was a pretty racist situation. So, and it's very interesting because the whole issue of racism, my parents basically never talked about it except indirectly. It was all kind of hidden. So I didn't see it. And I think, but anyways, that's another point. So my father's, in the arc of his life, he was very much about rules, how you were supposed to behave. And they were pretty rigid and they were pretty slanted, you know. As my sister was dying in the early 1990s, he was having to relax a lot of his rules. So when I was at UC Berkeley, well, LSD was around, pot was around, psilocybin was around. I was doing all those things. And my dad was telling me how he would arrest people who would be high on LSD, and he would arrest them for their own good and put them in handcuffs, and they would totally freak out and try to claw his eyes out. And he said, that's why the drug is so evil, right? I said, Dad, it's because of what you're doing to them. That's why they're doing that. Anyway, so by the time my sister was dying, my father was sending her medical marijuana, and because she needed it for her cancer. And a lot of what his assumptions about the world were relaxing. So, you know, he had a life in which she was learning a lot of really important things. And, you know, he actually opened up much more than my mother did in a life. So I had on me from my father from my mother issues of control, which means you set what you want to do consciously or unconsciously, and then you make it happen. So you're imposing it. And from my father, it was an issue of obeying rules and how to suppress all the things. You know, so it went into how to be a good student, you know, because I went to Harvard later and I was an A student, and I don't think had I really been more open, I don't think I would have invested that kind of energy into those pursuits, but that was pretty normal. Well, you know that from your own background.
I can relate. Yes. Yeah, I can relate to that.
My mother's ethnic group, the Lungdu, apparently I've been told that the majority of the extremely wealthy Chinese Americans in the United States are Lungdu. And all the very wealthy Chinese at the turn of the 1900s up through the 1950s were Lungdu people. Zhou Sheng, the gambling czar who was married into my family, Wang Yitgao, a couple of others, and so this affected me growing up, and I was not, you know. Oh, so the essence of my mother's control is underneath it all, what she learned to do was to take care of her siblings. So she's 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, and she's growing these kids that end up being, you know, and of course the ones she's growing are the ones that will be allowed to become doctors, where she won't, you know, that's very bittersweet for her. But there's this sense, so at the end of my mother's life, in the final days of her life, when she realized that she would die shortly, her life just changed. She just relaxed, opened up, and what came out of her was all the stuff she was when she was raising her kids. Because at her funeral, it was extraordinary. It was the first time you go to somebody's funerals, and sometimes things are revealed. So my mother's funeral, her brothers and sisters were there, and they talked about my mother in a way I'd never seen, because she was the real mother to them, because she's the one who raised them, because her mother, who my mother was very close to, took care of other things. So their attachments to their mother were familial, but it's kind of like my mother was the nanny that was raising them. That was really interesting to see. And that was when my mother died, the glow that was in the room was of that energy, at which yeah, go on.
That's so interesting, because how would, if framing your mom as being like their mom, how did they experience your mom as a mother figure versus you and your sister experiencing her as a mother figure? Like, obviously she'd evolved from childhood into adulthood and had all these different experiences, and I'm sure that her approach to raising kids as a 7-8-year-old and then through her teenage years was different by the time that she became an adult. So those sides of her that you didn't experience, were there sides of her mothering that you didn't experience?
Okay, so yeah, there's two answers. One is I had always been told by somebody, I don't know who, the age difference between me and my mother's youngest sibling, who's still alive, is 8 years. So, and someone said, "Well, you know, your mom endlessly raised kids, and you were partly seen as yet another person to take care of, right?" But another thing is, I've thought that up until my mom was 7 years old, she was living in China, and her father was the oldest son of the second wife. Who was, and his father was apparently a very successful Macau merchant, and came from a lineage apparently of 3 generations of merchants that had like 2 wives with 2 concubines, 3 wives, and the number of wives is only, this is true in China. You could have as many wives and concubines, but you had to support them. It isn't like the United States where or Western cultures where people have multiple relationships and they don't feel any responsibility. You have to support these people. So, but he was her father was in the United States because as the oldest of the second wife, he wouldn't inherit anything from his father because it would go to the first son of the first wife. So, although his father set him up in business in California, bought him a paper sun thing and all sorts of stuff. So my mother's childhood, which was, I think, before she came over, so in the first 7 years, she was insane. I mean, it was like a commune. That's what I picked up from her. And I think it's because when they were living in Macau in the large estate or something of the grandfather, there were all these kids because there were all the kids. All the wives and concubines had kids, right? So there are all these kids. She's growing up with a bunch of kids, and it's sort of, and she also has certain terrors when they're in the village, the rural village, where at that time, China's falling apart, and they're bandits, and people are running through the villages and tearing them down, and they're trying to kidnap the oldest sons for ransom money, etc. It was a terrible situation. So I always think that my mom was really, really open and good as a mother until we reached a certain age. And actually, my daughter had the same experience. My mom was just this fabulous, wonderful, facilitating, fun. Let's do this. Oh, let's go that. Let's learn to paint this way. Let's dance this way, right? Until Mindy got to a certain age. And then all of a sudden, my mother started, and Mindy would play a computer game. Mindy's very gifted at these. She's intellectually brilliant. But among other things, she would play these computer games with my mom when she was turning 8, 9, 10. And instead of playing them, my mother couldn't play them well. My mother would say, older people can't do these as well, right? And the relationship was becoming competitive, which is actually what my relationship with my mother became at that time, which was competitive, right? So I said, "Mom, can you teach me how you're playing this on the piano?" "No," she would say, "no." So Minnie went through that sort of thing. So that's what I think is I think my mother, because of her upbringing, she had this automatic switch. And by the time you became a certain age, love became switched from unconditional to conditional. I will love you if you do this. Yeah. And I'm doing this for your good.
Yeah. As you kind of reflect on that now, especially with the context of her upbringing, I guess when I hear her story, it's like I just hear, especially with the control and just, it's like she was just protecting her little girl, like the little girl that she was the entire time, right? And then that perpetual, the fear of danger or threat, because oftentimes control is like controlling your environment so that that little girl, so that your inner vulnerability or self is safe and feels good enough and worthy and all of these things. Has exploring the history of your family of origin or just your parents' upbringings, has that helped you come to peace with yourself or with your experiences? Or how does it, influence your relationship or your reflection of them?
Well, let's see. For me, there's a lot of parts in that. So, but one story which I want to give you is actually my mother's death. I find sometimes when you're around people right at the time of death, it's an extremely profound experience. And because we had gone through, my father and Ruth's mother and father all died within a very small span. And there was Ruth's parents, being Ukrainian Jews, were in Chicago. And there was a woman who's still alive who part of her job was taking care of people, you would say hospice, but as they're dying. And she's also a pretty spiritually advanced person. So we managed to get her to come out to take care of my mother, who we were told probably had just a couple of months left. So she flew out from Chicago. And this was in 2000. And she said, so she called up, she said, your mother's got 1 or 2 days left. So I went over. My mother was living in a place in Oakland that was a high-rise retirement home. It was a retirement home, and then if you became sick, they could take care of you. And then if you became really sick, they had a hospital wing. It's a really sweet thing. And my mother in her thing said, this will only be economically viable if I live for 7 years more, because then the payments will be at a benefit. Right? So the worst thing would be to die right away because the down payments and all this stuff would be financially not worth it. So to my mother's horror, she ended up getting what turned out to be pancreatic cancer. So as you know, that's pretty, and so she died within a year being there, which pissed her off at first, but financially, but but then she had this sort of opening up when it was, actually I was very gifted because with both my mother and father, right at the end of their life, I had the doctors told me, for example, with my mother, they thought they had figured out what was wrong with her, and so they opened her up for surgery, and she came out of the surgery thinking that she had been cured of something or other, that whatever they told her. And instead the doctor said, you have 45 minutes to tell your mother that she's terminal and she will go within a month, and because we're starting morphine. That was really interesting. So my mother comes out of it. She's absolutely elated. She says, I'm fixed, all that. And I had to tell her, you're dying instead. And that was, she just took it just straight on. And then that's when she switched. And so in her death, the reason why I brought up the earlier unconditional love is so just before she died, Ruth took a phone call from her hula friends. There were like 15 women who all go out and hula dance. They used to at the Berkeley Senior Center. And my mother's main friend called up and said, yeah, my mom gave them all her hula stuff. There's tons of tchotchkes for hula. I don't know what it is. And so Ruth took the phone call and said to my mom, who, that so-and-so says they got your hula things. So my mother, who was in bed and hadn't moved much in the last 24 hours, turned towards Ruth to say something, and that was her last breath, right? So my experience was that out of her throat or out of her mouth came a form, and it hovered over me. And it took...
You saw this.
Oh, I saw this. Of course, no one else is going to see this. And actually,
But you saw it.
I saw this. And Hillary, her oldest granddaughter, was in the room at the time, and she has another version of this. But and her vision was different, but somewhat similar. And my mother was like caressing me as if I was like 2 or 3 years old, or a newborn baby for what seemed like 20 minutes. I have no idea how long it really was.
Wait, so could you describe it again? So she turned and took her last breath, and then you saw an energy form come out of her mouth and then hover, and then
over me.
Over you.
Yeah, but then it was like I was lifted up and sort of swaddled like that. That was remarkable.
Yeah.
It was extraordinary. The imagery for my father is quite different.
Were you there in the moments of his death as well?
We had Mindy and I had flown back to California because my mom had called up. My father died, 4.5 years before, and he had all sorts of things wrong. But the basic thing was he had cancers, and he also had very advanced Parkinson's, and probably related to DDT exposure. And my mother's cancer may also have been related because my sister, anyways, that's more complicated. So anyways, but my father had essentially been emotionally rejected by my mother because as he was becoming sick, my mother wasn't devoted to taking care of him. She was really concerned that my father's driving behavior he'd get in an accident and they'd be financially destitute because they'd have to pay millions. My mother was thinking everything in terms of finances at that time. And I had understood late in life that my mother and father met each other on the rebound back in 1940 because my father's first love, who everyone in his family really liked, they didn't particularly like my mom, was a woman who I guess was quite wonderful, but she died of tuberculosis. And my mother was engaged to be married to a Jewish man.
Oh,
and
wow.
His family said, no way, you are not marrying anyone who isn't a Jew. So that was a 2.5-year relationship at Berkeley that just cut off. So they both were on the rebound, and apparently my father's father figured out they were sleeping together and said, you have to get married. Anyways, so that's...
Yeah.
That, let's see. So my father had this sort of sense of his loves dying on him. So as he was starting to collapse, so just before he really became sick, my sister died of cancer also. And it was a really horrible death. And so my father had this, so by the time he was dying, there was a sense of resignation and a sense of loss of loved ones who are not there. And so I mean, I sensed that. And so when we got the call that my father had just died, my parents lived in Kensington. So we got the call in Kensington, and I went within a half an hour. I was down at the rest home where my father had died. And I knew what he would want is like something kind of formal. So I got there just as the coroner was there. And so I helped put my father in the bag, and I gave him a salute. That's what I figured. And but it was really hard because even at the end of his life, he had 4-stage Parkinson's, so he could not communicate, even though he probably was thinking quite clearly. So yeah, it was quite different. And I was not that significant to my father because he was very attached to my sister, and her death really just ripped him apart. Yeah.
Wow. All of the different components. What your mom wanted to marry a Jewish man, and then you marry a Jewish woman.
That's right. Yep. Yeah.
So then how was that, I guess, being generationally American, was that culturally, by the time that it came to your point of marriage, in your family or environment, was it more acceptable for you to marry someone who wasn't Chinese?
Yeah. In my mother's family, one of her brothers married a Scandinavian woman from Minnesota. So there already was.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
And in my father's family, there were precedents for that, although earlier and my father's mother, who had made it her goal to befriend and stay in touch with all the members of the extended family who had been shunned because they were interracial. So my father's mother's oldest brother married 2 Irish women, and there were offspring, and the offspring were all shunned.
Oh wait, he married both of them?
Well, in a row.
2 wives?
In a row.
Oh okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so this is, God, let me work back. I think it's in the 1920s and 30s. So
wow.
So one of the aunts that he married, and then one of the offsprings from one of those marriages, the only people in the family apparently that would speak to them were my father's mother and her children, because they were shunned by the rest of the family. So my grandmother on that side was open to it. So my grandfather also, my father's father had to deal with the fact that not only was I marrying a Jew, but my sister had also married a German Jew. And my grandfather was reported to be anti-Semitic because he was apparently fucked over in business deals by Jews, but he kept his mouth shut. My grandfather was socially extraordinarily smooth, and he didn't let any of this out. And it was, yeah. So that
this was the Cantonese. That was the Cantonese family with the saving face and the keeping things under wraps.
Yeah. So. Yeah, and I grew up at a time period in which, I remember when someone pointed out to me, oh, well, when you have kids, you're going to have Chinese kids. I said, really? I thought I was going to have blonde kids. That goes to show how confused, and race was, it was, I grew up, Berkeley was very, very diverse when I grew up. So when I grew up, half of Berkeley High School was black. If you can imagine that, everything from Sacramento Street west was all black in Berkeley, and and there were extraordinarily interesting people in Berkeley at that time. It wasn't the upper middle class haven that it is now. So how that affected my child rearing. I mean, on one hand, there are skills that Mindy picked up from me, and she also got the brunt end of some really terrible things. Right. One was control, and a lot of my control expressed itself in anger. It needed to be like this. It has to be like this. Right. And then when it didn't happen, poof, right? And so Mindy came of age, 7, 8, around the time of my sister's dying, which was one of the most stressful periods of time for me because my architectural practice was really starting to thrive, and the practice would collapse in that period of time because I had to. My sister's death was painful, but my sister's death caused my father to start collapsing, and then my mother was collapsing, trying to take care of everything. And it was a total. I won't get into the complication. Yeah. So I basically had to give up my work to take care of my parents. And so, unfortunately, Mindy got the brunt of this anger. And then I realized that there's this history of rage that runs through my father's family, of which Mindy was a recipient. I was a recipient from my father. I mean, because it gets modeled to you. You know, everyone gets angry and can yell and scream, but you have to be modeled of how to do this, right? And so my father did it to me, and my father got it from his father. And his father got it from his father. So the origin point is the origin of the Lym family, which is in the document in my documentary called Dogpatch Ranch, which is that Lim Lip Hong, my great grandfather, had a huge. He and his second son, which was my grandfather, fought each other, and my grandfather and they apparently, according to my father's sister, who had tons of information that unfortunately I wasn't able to get a lot of it, they would physically fight each other. And my grandfather grew up with Irishmen and learned to fight because to defend himself and to fight. And he also befriended a lot of Irishmen. And he's taking on his father. My grandfather was 5'2", and his father was 6'1".
Wow. Wow.
I mean, I don't know anything of that. But at the end of my great grandfather's life, he was no longer with his family in San Francisco. He was living with my grandfather and my father and his siblings in Berkeley for off and on for 4 or 5 years of their life. It was so there's this lineage of rage that runs through, and I didn't understand it of what it was like. And so when I try to understand from Mindy what it's like to have received my anger, a large part of it is articulated by Mindy or Mindy's cousin, who is my sister's last kid. When my sister died, he came to Berkeley to spend a week with my parents, and then we all went camping, without my parents. But my father came on to him, apparently, my guess is the same way he did to me, and it was just obnoxious. I said, oh my God. And so at the end, Ian could do nothing right. You had to do it this way or not. And then, and so my father at the end wanted Ian to kiss him, and Ian wasn't going to kiss him. And $5, no. $25, no. I mean, Ian was 7 years old. I mean, he had lots of guts. So, yeah, he never kissed him.
Like, kiss him in what way?
Like goodbye.
Oh, gosh. Oh, that's so, I mean, it's so fascinating hearing, because it sounds like you have a great deal of self-awareness about this rage, this anger, or even just from my perspective of you having lived all these decades, it sounds like you're just very aware like you're not in the thick of it. Like, it doesn't sound like you're in the thick of the anger anymore, but rather are able to kind of zoom out and have a more zoomed out perspective of your life and like almost observe your experience or observe your parenting. And I'm curious, like, what was that transition for you? Was it your own spiritual journey, like therapy, like from going and living the rage or whatever it was that you were living from to seeing the rage and transforming your relationship with it or the way that you express or work with that energy?
Well, the rage felt good because you could take a situation that was unbearable and you'd feel good. Of course, everyone else,
Yeah.
absolutely not.
Yeah.
And if you're impressionable, a young kid, it's disastrous. So, so a lot of it had to do with therapy. So, let's see. So Ruth and I started couples therapy because I realized that I was gay in about, at the end of the 1980s. And so, and I was very frank with her and she was frank with me. So we started therapy to sort of deal with this. And
And that was how many years into your marriage?
we got married in 1970. I mean.
So that was maybe 10, 20 years into your marriage.
Yeah, but we had lived together since 67, 68. I mean, it was I didn't want to get married and Ruth wanted to get married. So I said, okay, well, I can only have this relationship if we get married. So, okay, so I'll get married. Right. This was my heroes at the time were John and Yoko. John Lennon and Yoko Ono, right? So, so we had this therapy going, and then when my father was dying and particularly Ruth's mother was dying, we realized that I think it was Ruth first. So Ruth started individual therapy. So, and then I started individual therapy later. So we had 3 therapies going. And then Mindy wanted therapy. So, okay, I may have this backwards, but she also wanted a therapy where the 3 of us were there. Actually, she's the orchestrator of this. So that was the first one, and it was in the family therapy of the 3 of us. So we had at one point 5 therapies going on. So because of death, there were inheritances, and inheritance helped pay off rather big therapy bills. So, and it was in a lot of my anger issues came up at the beginning in the family therapy, and the family therapist we had was extraordinary, and how she was working with me to realize this. And I remember one time I was yelling and screaming, and I walked out of the therapist's office. So the therapist came after me and said, you have, at this moment, you have reacted as if you're a child, but a child can't interact with the situation with the adults that are in the room back there. So you can make a choice between how you're reacting, right? So that was the first time that it basically was pointed out to me. I think Ruth had survived my yelling because her father did that to her. Although what it turns out is that, that's Ruth. So that's the beginning. So it's an ongoing thing. Anger is an ongoing measure, and it certainly is. So this brings us. So the current issue of what you're talking about, curiosity, comes because in my family, everyone goes to China just before they die, right? So 2 or 3 years before they die, everybody goes to China. This is a country, old country, blah, blah, blah. I mean, that was before recent years. So I decided to do that, but I decided and I went in 2017, and I did it as an academic tour, a bunch of Harvard professors, and before I went, I wrote out everything that therapy had taught me not to be that my parents wanted me to be. And I wrote this all out in a page and a half because I wanted to see, because I had the feeling that China would be a big version of my parents. And I came back realizing, yes, it's a big version of my parents. And I said, okay, so very materialistic, very you control yourself for the good of other people, because the good of other people, well, I mean, that's a positive thing, because Asians, Japanese, Singaporeans, maybe Malaysians, Vietnamese, Chinese, they don't have a problem wearing a mask, which a lot of Westerners have problems wearing a mask, and it's enough for big political things, but no big deal. In China, you wear a mask, or in Japan. So, but on the other hand, there's underneath that. So I came back and I said, okay, I think I need to get back into Buddhist practice. So that's when I said,
wait, when you say get back into it, when was round one?
Round one was around the time I got, it was 1977. So it's when Ruth and I moved back to Bay Area. And I was off and on in it for about 5 years. And
Gotcha.
Yeah. So
and it's so interesting as well, just I love that you wrote that letter before going, with the sense of what that being in that environment might ruffle up for you, because it's kind of like those types of experiences when we're in an environment that seems to be so contrasting our values, or our choices, or the ways that maybe we desire to live our lives. It's like this massive mirror that reflects back and is like, oh, okay, that what is represented in this environment, or what I'm picking up on, or the way that these people are choosing to live their lives, that's actually not for me. And it can help us come back to like the center of what is true for us. And it sounds like after you went to China and you encountered this amplification of like your parents' upbringing, that you were like, okay, you connected with your spiritual center.
well, it's quite ironic, because China is the source of really major philosophical and religious traditions that are quite different. I think the main thing that I learned was that is not to accept the identity given to me by my parents. So, in Chinese society, one of the big things is you don't speak unless you're spoken to, and you're supposed to know what you're supposed to do. You're not supposed to ask what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to already know by figuring it out. You're supposed to have figured it out. And so what you're supposed to do has nothing to do with what you want to do. It's what your parents want to do, right? So that was a big deal. So, however, there are weird versions of it, because the Western version of Western individualism is a little bit different than I think more spiritually developed sense of self. It's not just, well, I don't have to do that. I'm not going to do that. You're doing that. I'm going to do this. And that's reactive, and it's quite different.
So what's your Buddhist practice now, or your relationship, or your spiritual practice in general? What's that for you now?
Well, so I came back and I started looking at YouTube. I said, oh, okay, what's there? So I had previously been connected to, in the 70s, a titular member of a place called Dharmadhatu, which was the really big, huge Sangha, made the cover of Time magazine, that Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche had founded in the West. And then it had this scandalous history, which a lot of Tibetan Buddhism seems to get involved with. And so I had stopped the practice, but there obviously must have been something of interest to me. And I remember, I think it was 1978. It's actually very funny. It's a week-long meditation retreat in the Santa Monica Hills, or the canyons, which probably have all burnt down. And I came out of that retreat having, a quiet mind. And
was it Vipassana? What style of retreat was it? Was it Vipassana?
No, it was a shamatha, awareness of breath, and no Vipassana as a part of it. So, it was an experience, and it was a very pleasurable experience. And in the meantime, Ruth was staying with all of her relatives in Los Angeles, and so I show up. She picks me up and brings me into her big Jewish family, and they say, "So you're studying to be a priest, right?" So all of this experience vanishes within 3 hours, right? As we're sitting around the pool discussing blah 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 blah, right? And now I know of that experience as being a yam, which is it's the best way to do it is you don't think about it, you just do it again, and it's potentially a signpost, but don't think too much about it because the actual reality is different. So,
do you mean like the Yamas and the Yamas and the Niyamas? Is that
maybe
or
that's
is Yama
no. You can talk about that because I don't know this terminology, but
just the Yamas and the Niyamas are, if I'm remembering my yoga philosophy from my training earlier, just a couple months ago, the Yamas are essentially these ethical practices or things that you add to your life, or you choose to, like, positive things, in the positive negative language. And then the niyamas are things that you choose to, like, remove from your life, essentially. So it's like is that correct? I don't know. But basically, there are things like the vow of non-stealing or truthfulness and chastity and generosity. They're basically these like ethical kind of guidelines and practices, or maybe some of them are actions and some of them are clearly it is what it is, but I was just curious if the yam was related to that yam.
No. I learned this thing from a Buddhist teacher whose name is Andrew Holochek. And he uses the term as being, you can have a kind of a profound or peak experience doing a meditation practice, but you shouldn't hold on to it. Because it actually, when you hold on to it and you attempt to reproduce it or you're grasping it, it actually destroys your meditation practice. It destroys the openness. And just give it up.
Absolutely.
Just give it up, right?
Yeah, the non-attachment is one of the key ones, and it's interesting because I love that, just the image of you coming and just having this quiet mind and then entering like Jewish family like extravaganza, because it reminds me of, I went on a Jesuit retreat just a couple months ago. And so I had 10 years in Catholic educational institutions, went to Catholic high school and then Jesuit university and then worked in the Catholic high school. And I'm personally not, I'm, spiritual. I feel like it's all one thing. But it was interesting going back to this Jesuit retreat because it was the first Catholic environment that I'd been in since college, or to the first like Catholic retreat experience that I'd been in since college, and the first mass that I'd gone to. But one of the things that they said at the final mass is we were wrapping up our weekend experience, which was a silent retreat, and it was so beautiful and wonderful. It was literally on a mountaintop, so you're at the top of the hill and just like gorgeous campus. And they talked about just mountaintop peak experiences, how going on a retreat can be like this peak experience, that then it's about how do you integrate that when you go back into the valley of daily life. And so you going to like the Jewish family or just re-entering society outside of the retreat, because the retreat, they are these beautiful bubbles where we can, in silence and solitude and connection and intentional community and all of these things, connect with the essence of ourselves. And then once we have that connection, that's not where it ends, that's actually where it begins. Because then the opportunity is, how do we show up in our quote unquote regular spaces, our daily lives, just moment to moment when we're brushing our teeth or cooking dinner? Like, what is it to integrate that peak experience or come from that place that we connected with in what seems to be the mundane? And can we still remain, and this is something that I've been within myself just focused on over the past months and years, really the idea of vibrational autonomy, of can I stay in my center regardless of what seems to be chaos around me? Like, everyone else can be in their own energies, everyone can be showing up exactly as they're showing up, and can I stay true to myself and my heart, and can I stay in peace while war is essentially, can I stay in peace while war may be breaking out around me? And I think that that's like the idea of the retreat not being a pause or an ending, but really just an ignition and an opportunity to integrate that spark that has then been connected, or even having the opportunity to have a felt sense within your body of what it's like to have a quiet mind. Like, that is so powerful, to even just be able to recognize that experience. Because then once we recognize, oh, this is what inner peace or inner quietude is like, when we experience what seems to not be inner peace, or what seems to be inner conflict or distress or anxiety, then we have that reference point, and we have the lived experience of knowing that it is possible for us to be in that state. Yeah.
Yes. So so one of the things is to actually have that experience of peace as everything is falling apart, and your mind is racing all over the place. So that's why in what I do, the instructions now are, don't hold on to it, So because it will keep you from the training that will eventually happen, where you can bring the sense of collection and, I don't want to use the term centeredness, even though everything is exploding in your mind. You don't have to calm the mind down necessarily, but that, yeah.
Yeah, because it can just float on by, and it changes state anyway.
Yeah.
Like, and it can really, we get to relate to the mind in any way that we want to, and sometimes it can even be amusing. Like that, bringing the level of humor and like chuckling at the mind can help me as well. Yeah.
So one of the
Go ahead.
Yeah, so one of the things I liked about working on the documentary is there's a lot of events.
Which one?
The one about called Sidewalk During a Time of COVID-19 is there are a lot of clips in there when you look at them, and people will be appalled. Either they say, ugh, like a friend of mine said, why do you even want to look at that, right? Or this is appalling, or look at those like decrepit people, or
Yeah.
and then you realize in their own it's this term called mental illness that seems to involve about at least a third of the homeless around my neighborhood. And like last night, there was crashing outside in front of these condominiums that cost $1.5 million. There's somebody outside who's half naked, and he's banging and crashing something and yelling and screaming and going up and down the block. And I'm saying, probably inside his mind, there's something very real going on. And one of the things that I've learned as San Francisco has started to come back to life, and I live right near Folsom Street, which is a big bar scene and club scene. So as people are showing up Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and there's a lot of drunk people on the street and all this, a lot of these folks, and they're usually guys, who are who would scare people because they're doing individually things that seem, they don't like all that around. And they will avoid a group of, 5 young people coming back from a dance bar because they just don't want to be around these people, even though they're spouting out all this stuff. I'm going to kill this stuff. I'm going to go right. That's extremely interesting. And
Yeah, what's your experience in watching all that footage? Because they're really, I mean, you creating this documentary it's really a gift. It's a gift and it's an opportunity, but I see everything as being a potential gift or opportunity. These things that can potentially trigger, like you're describing, those reactions of disgust, judgment, fear. Do you notice those energies arise within you as you encounter the footage? And then how do you kind of be with that? Or is that something that you're like, okay, let me inquire why this is arising, and then can I like just hold it all with curiosity and compassion? Like, what is your relationship as you encounter something that maybe sparks or triggers that reactive state?
Well, actually, it's kind of interesting. So, given in meditation practice, where one of the rules of my meditation practice is you will let anything come to mind that comes to mind. All right. And try not to suppress it. So, the thing about looking at surveillance camera footage is you can, oh my God, this is heavy duty. I'm not going to look at it. And so 2 days later, you can look at it. And then you can look at it again. Okay, I think this is going on. And then you look at it again. And say, oh, there's something else going on. Look at it on a larger screen, and you can say, oh, that person is seeing this thing over in the bush. And there's one little video clip that didn't make it into the documentary. And there's this guy who's very stoned, and he's walking up the street, and he stops because right in front of him, someone has dropped a towel, right? And so he's going around with his hands and like this. And then after 2 minutes of whatever he's doing there, he bends down, picks up the towel, throws it to the side, and walks straight on, as if the towel is a door, right? And at first I didn't understand that. And I was trying to, what the hell is going on? So it took a while to sort. So in the practice of running through these videotapes has made me more attuned to how to relate to what's going on. And, you know, and it doesn't mean that I don't have the old reactions, but they're kind of happening. And then there are other ones. And then you sort of think back on it, you know, what's going on. And, you know, well, I don't know if you want to talk about this, but there were there's three in the COVID period. I was Asian bashed almost, and then in the documentary, there's someone who breaks into my unit, but I don't think they're really after me. But for some reason, I end up being the person breaks a window at. And then recently. I was driving back, and this car cuts in front of me and bashes up my car, right? So I've noticed that, and I'm kind of happy about this, in these conditions of physical threat, how I'm relating to it is actually, I'm kind of happy with that. I'm just trying to stay very present. You know, like when this young kid, I don't know, I don't think he's obviously not, this was about a year and a half ago, in the middle of all the Asian bashing, and he's got a broken bottle, and I'm walking down the street, and he comes around me and he looks me in the face and he says, "Prepare to die, faggot, Chinaman," right? And so I'm thinking in the back of my head a couple of things. One, where should I go? How do I protect myself? I don't want to go down over there because there's more people, and he may end up hurting other people. And so then I figured that there's a move. I'm not a martial arts person. I can disarm him in a particular way. So I do that. And there's actually more to it possible. Or in the accident, if I had just totally freaked out, my car would have been severely hurt. So I just allowed. This guy was cutting in front of me on the freeway, so I just allowed my car to be dragged over with him by steering with him that way, which actually now means my car, I think it just has a busted fender rather than a fucked up front wheel. And, it's interesting because I think that practices of being present help under conditions of extreme stress.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, even with paramedics and all different types of emergency responders, first responders, they're teaching them like breathwork practices and things like that because it's being with the nervous system. And that, well, I'm so glad to hear that your meditation practice and your practice of being present has supported you in those. I'm so glad to hear that you're okay and well and like those all supported. And it is even because in that sense, it's like, yes, we might have a meditation practice where it's like a retreat. We sit down where we are on our own and we are focused on, maybe it's like a sitting meditation where it's just like quiet and we're just like watching our mind. But really and at least how I choose to live it's everything is meditation. Meditation is a quality of awareness that you're bringing to the present moment. And whether you're watching footage of the security camera or you're just driving and something is happening, with that level of awareness and presence, we're able to have that clarity of being connected to all the resources that are already within us. Like you in that moment of somebody standing before you and saying, prepare to die. It's like if your nervous system is in full fight, flight, or freeze, then that's just happening. Versus as we spend more time with our nervous systems, we can allow them to be nervous without living from that nervousness. It's like the nervous system can have its reaction and its response, but we remember that we're not just the nervous system, that we are connected with the thing that gets to be aware of and includes the nervous system. And even that, I mean, just the willingness to continue to go back, like, I love how you described the journey of being with a particular, video footage or anything where it's like initially, maybe we turn away, maybe we look away, but then a couple days later, maybe we revisit it and then we are able to watch it and then maybe we like amplify it and we're able to hang out with it more. And I think so many of us there are so many examples of that across our lives of something that maybe sparked fear and then we take that one baby step. We take the baby step and then we discover we survive. And then we take another baby step and, oh, look, we're still alive and we're still safe. And then on and on we go. But yeah, it just all comes down to just being with what is present in the moment. But if we were in that, like if you were standing there and faced with someone that said, prepare to die, and you turned away or you chose not to see that was the reality of your situation or the reality of that moment, then in some ways that's kind of that willing blindness within whatever circumstance it is, that like choice to be blind or that choice not to see, it can disconnect our conscious awareness from the resourcefulness, from the choice, the freedom, the power, all the things that are already here, because we're choosing not to see, or because it's kind of like chopping off your own legs.
Well, yeah. In the case of the guy, the prepare to die guy.
Did you successfully disarm him?
Yeah.
What happened? How did that unfold? Okay.
No, I knocked the glass out of his hand. Then he ended up picking it up and following me. And then he was yelling and screaming at me, and I ducked because I realized he's not going to be able to accurately throw it. So he missed me, right? But in the case of that, and there's a couple of other things that are involved there, but that occurred 4 hours after a 5-day online Buddhist retreat concluded with my main teacher, Mingyur Rinpoche. So I was really prepped for that because of that. And it was, yeah.
Mm. That's it was like an alternate version of the walking into the
Yeah,
Jewish
exactly.
family.
Exactly.
uh, wow. Huh. So many. I feel like I'm just like marinating in all of
Mm,
these stories that you've so
mm,
graciously shared and generously
thank
shared
you.
from, yeah,
Yeah.
your decades of life. And as we, as we kind of come to a close in this moment of just a temporary close of this conversation, I would love to just open it and hand the floor over to
Yeah.
you if there's anything that you're inspired to, just speaking directly to anyone who might be watching
Mm,
or listening, any takeaways or, final words, whatever you're inspired to
mm.
share.
Well, I first want to say it's, curiosity. This is like
Mm,
this format you have of of going into this is just extraordinary. And congratulations.
mm.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Uh,
Yeah.
I don't know how I would what I would say more, but yeah, it is a really interesting situation to actually. You know what? That's I think it was one of our therapists said. Uh, I think Ruth would remember this, but her thing, don't be furious, be curious. I think that was
That feels that feels very fitting for our conversation.
yeah. She was, I think, Ruth and my marriage counselor for a decade, and she basically said, "Okay, you guys have to stop therapy with me because I've given you a communication system, so you can communicate. I have no idea what's going to happen, so
Mm,
just you know." But she's the
yeah.
one who had that term. I thought that was
Hmm. Yeah, and I love that. Don't be furious, be curious. And with what we were just saying at the end of just not suppressing anything and letting the fury arise. And then we get to be curious about what we're furious about. Like we get to be curious about the fury as well. As well as just curious about the whole world around us. And I feel like that very much ties to, like, I love what you said about the half naked man running outside your street yesterday. Of, for him, what he was experiencing in his mind was very real, and that capacity to see through what seems to be. And yeah, it's like there's a level of empathy and awareness and compassion and understanding for just the multiplicity and multidimensionality and multifaceted nature of the human experience, that like we can look at one thing from a million different perspectives. And even how we began this, of the way that you talked about history and the relevance of history being in the moment, the relevance of history being in the present moment context, and the way that we tell the stories of our history changes depending on who we are in that moment, who we're with, who we're around, what the world is like. Yeah. I'm just
yeah.
so grateful to have gotten to spiral within with you. And yeah.
So, I guess one final thing I would say too is uh, I think your generation is going to face things that are absolutely extraordinary. And I thought, okay, so now nobody needs to leave the country of their origin and move to another country, which in my family happened at various times. And now we're in the situation where that may be very, very prevalent for various reasons, because a lot of the understandings of what's going, well, we have in California, we're in the situation where uh, at the moment there are no big fires going, but there's no reason why there aren't. and what that portends. I mean, it's already wiped out a whole section of the Central Valley where people used to be. And that's only, I think, probably the beginning. So the need to be curious rather than furious is going to be a way to survive, I think.
Yeah. And really that gift of just asking questions and meeting things with curiosity, it's because there's an openness to curiosity, and that's, I think, something that you definitely, the way that you've lived your life and even the way that you reflect on your life, past, present, and future, there's an openness that, yeah, I just appreciate. I think is a wonderful reminder to continue having that open-minded curiosity.
Well, I think it's a feature of the present. I don't think it was a feature of my life prior.
Which, what a testament. Like, yeah, exactly. Like a testament to evolution and the capacity for even just hearing your parents and the way that, whether it was in the final days before they transitioned or in the final months, you know, like the capacity for human evolution is in and of itself inspiring. Yeah. Oh, well, thank you so much, Glenn. And thank you to everyone. Thank you. Thank you to everyone watching and listening. Take care.
Be well.